called Better Planning, a Better Outcome. Just helping organizations or nonprofit organizations to be able to prove their impact. And again, welcome to this fourth week. The fourth week we're going to be talking about, or the title of this is Prove Your Why. And last week we talked about understanding and documenting your why, which really just slightly touched upon expectations. But we're going to go a little bit deeper into relational expectations this week. But last week, talking about, I think a huge point last week was it's one thing for you to be able to tell your story as an organization, but it's so much more when you don't even have to say anything for your story to be told. When other people can tell your story, or for numbers or statistics to tell your story, but really just emphasizing the power of stories. But again, this week we're going to dig a little bit deeper into relationships, more specifically relationship expectations. I like expectations because in thinking of any type of relationship, when expectations are very clear and you know the expectations of each person and you're able to meet them, well, then you're able to figure out the relationship that's the right fit for you, especially when I'm actually able to meet them. But say I have an expectation and the other person has them and we just aren't seeing eye to eye, well, that's okay because I'm able to figure out a relationship that's not the best fit for me. I think the same principle applies with relationships with donors. A donor may have an expectation and you as an organization will most definitely have an expectation. And sometimes they just don't line up. You guys are not seeing eye to eye. And I know from just personal experience working for an organization, a lot of times we want to just shape our expectations to meet the donor's expectations with doing any and everything possible. But sometimes that's just not possible. And it's okay for an organization to not meet donors' expectations. I think it's actually very healthy to be able to communicate that. But sometimes those expectations do line up. And this is all about talking about how to figure out what is the right fit for you as an organization when going into this relationship with a specific donor. I think a great example that I was taught just growing up is that when interviewing for a job, you're not just being interviewed. You're also interviewing the person that's interviewing you. You're not only just allowing yourself to be interviewed so they can figure out if you're the right fit for their job, but you also want to interview them to figure out if that job is the right fit for you. And that is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Find the right fit for your organization through expectations. I think a really cool thing just to think about and give you a structure through this time is that as organizations and donors, we have problems that we want to address and we have solutions that to those problems. And in those problems and in those solutions, we have the donor has expectations and organizations, you guys have expectations. And it's really to our benefit to figure out what those are. But that's how we're going to talk about this. We're going to go through problems talking about our expectations and donors' expectations. Then we're going to talk about solutions and talk about our expectations of solutions and donors' expectations of solutions. A really good graphic for you guys, just to simplify it, is what is on your screen right now. When you think of a problem, you think about this is the beginning stages. This is the thing that we want to address. We want to hit head on. We want to provide a solution for and resolve. So you can think of the problem as an introduction. The conclusion is the solution. You are closing that book as thus or in as you are providing that solution for that problem. And the last part is the body paragraph, the thing that brings it all together. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. But this is the graphic that I want you guys to have that just simplifies this entire week and this entire presentation. So if you guys have to screenshot it, I'm going to send it out later after that. But whatever you do, this is a really important graphic that just simplifies expectations. And so let's start talking about the problem. So under the problem, how do you figure out what your expectations are? Well, I think a good question to ask you and your organization, all the board members, all the people that work for your organization, is figuring out or asking yourself, what does your organization see as the main problem for the population that you're serving? What does your organization see as the main problem for the population that you are serving? Now, when you ask that and you answer it, you want to be as specific as possible. You don't want to be broadened in your response. You don't want to have a general response. And what do I mean by that? You don't want to just say poverty rate or addiction rate or opioid use rate or homeless rate, homelessness rate. You don't want to just use those broadened terms. You want to be as specific as possible. And for example, as I use poverty rate, well, I need to identify poverty rate in what community? Is it in the entirety of the state? Is it in the entirety of the country? Is it in a specific subset in that city? I need to identify where the poverty rate is that I'm addressing. And so maybe I'd say poverty rate, I'm in Philadelphia again. So maybe I'd say poverty rate in Kensington, Philadelphia. Okay, now after giving not to the solution, but after giving the population or the community, I need to identify, okay, what is the statistic of how I know the poverty rate is poor? And so maybe I look it up and I figure out the poverty rate in Kensington is 70% high. Well, I see that as a problem. That's too high. And so my problem is that the poverty rate in Kensington, Philadelphia is 70%, and that's too high. That is very specific. You know the community that you're serving, you know the community that you're focused on, and you also know the statistic that's supporting it. And so later on down the line, after a year or 2 years, you'll be able to see if your solution has brought down that poverty rate. But this is called constructing the problem. If you don't construct the problem and make it as specific as possible, well, then it's going to take away from you actually figuring out if your solution was actually something that did work. So in beginning stages, understanding your expectations for the problem, you want to ask yourself, or your organization, what does your organization see as the main problem? Donors' expectations now for the problem. You have to take the time to ask the donor, what do they see as the main problem for the population served? So for that same population, using that same example, talking about Kensington, Philadelphia, I want to ask the donor, well, what do you see as the main problem for this population? But in doing that, you're not working through, what do I think? Or what do I feel the donor shows or sees as the main problem? No, I'm not going to go off what I think or what I feel. I want to go off what I know. And the only way I'm going to really know that is if I take the time to ask them. And this is something that honestly, we just don't think about because we're so just gung-ho for moving forward, which isn't a bad thing. Gung-ho or passionate is probably a better word to use. So passionate about moving forward and addressing this problem that we don't take the step back to ask, well, what does the donor actually see as the problem worth addressing? And I think that's something that we need to ask, specifically the donor. And again, not going off what we think and not going off what we feel, but taking the time to ask them, what does the donor actually see as the main problem worth addressing? And what does this do? Well, as it pertains to the problem, it lines up the expectations. So now you know that you have your expectations for the problem and you have the donor's expectation for the problem. And it so happens that it's the right fit. So when you go and research donors for funding for your programs or for your organization, well, you can research based off of problems. And you know very specifically, rather than doing a broad and general search, you can research, oh, these are donors that actually address and see the problems that I want to address. These are donors that I can reach out to. These are donors that provide a right fit for your organization. And if they don't, it's okay. And this is a sub-tangent of that possibly, but it is absolutely also applicable, is that if your expectations don't line up with the donor, and I'm going to say this at the end, it's okay. Because even though they're providing funding for you, you're adding value to the funding. Let me say it again. Even though they're providing funding for you, you're adding value to the funding. You're actually doing something with the funding. You're making that funding valuable, which means that as an organization, we just have to understand our worth in that and see that it's okay for us to not go forward with a donor simply because their expectations don't line up with us or we just can't meet their expectations. Let's go on to solutions. So solutions, focusing on our expectations, your expectations as an organization. Then you could ask yourself, what solution does your organization provide to address the main problem? What solutions does your organization provide to address the main problems? And again, like we said in past weeks, that you want to figure out the solutions that you directly, problems that you directly address, solutions that in which you provide that directly address the problem, directly, not indirectly. And so again, asking yourself, what solutions does your organization provide to address the main problem? What's to be super helpful in you guys figuring out, well, what solutions do we actually have? But then again, donor expectations, taking the time to ask the donor this, what solution does the donor want you as an organization to provide to address that problem? What solutions does the donor want you as an organization to provide to address the main problem? And here's the thing with that. Maybe the donor wants you to provide a certain solution that you know just is not going to work because you're on the ground. You're the front line. You're the people that are actually doing things in a programmatic fashion in the community. So you know what works. And maybe the donor is saying, I can't support that because I just want to see this solution. Well, then you know that it's probably not the best fit for your organization relationally, because they are expecting you to provide a certain solution in which that you just don't see as the best for that community. And you probably know what's best for your community because you, again, are working in it. And so it's lining up these expectations. And so what happens is, in the end, looking through problems and the solutions of your expectations and the donor's expectations, well, then you have a very specific search when you go onto the internet and you look up donors, or you start researching what donors do we really want to have. Well, you can research donors based off of problems and the solutions that they're looking for and see if it lines up with your mission statement, with your values. And if it doesn't, it's okay. If you're willing to conform to that, then that's okay too. But also understand that you as an organization, you're the frontline workers. You probably know what's best for that community in which you're serving because you are actually the people that are doing the work. And the donor may just not know that because they've lost touch with the community that they actually want to serve, but they're simply the funding source. And so that's the dynamic that you have to go back and forth with in talking with the donor. And so that's the cool thing about that research process, is that you can be very selective in thinking of different donors or researching different donors. But here's the last part that is the hang up for most organizations. It's not the problem, it's not the solution, it's the body paragraph, if you will. It's the middle gap. You think of the problem in the beginning and you think of the solution, but how do you know that solution actually works? How do you know that solution addresses the problem? Or using the example, how do you know that this conclusion actually is the conclusion of this introduction? What's the middle? What's the body paragraph? Fill the gap. How do you know? And that's a tough question to answer, because most of the time we provide an anecdotal type of response. We provide success stories just in general, really convincing ones at that, but it doesn't go any further than that. And it may be qualitative, but we don't provide a quantitative answer for this. And the next step is figuring out, how can we connect the dots between this solution and this problem without providing an anecdotal response? And it starts with you asking your organization, how do you know your solutions really work? How do you know your solutions are actually addressing those problems? And the way you fill the gap, the thing that is actually terms to fill the gap, is called a theory of change, where you're able to look at, this is the beginning, this is the end, and this is how I know my solution works. That's what a theory of change is. And that's one thing that I can help you out on. doing what it looks like to go from beginning to end and proving that that solution actually works. But here's the interesting thing about that. All solutions are gifts, because even though you may be able to prove from beginning to end why and how your solution works, so many different external factors could come into play during that time to make that solution not work. And so it's a gift for that result to actually work. It's a gift for that solution to work. And I think that's really important for us to understand, is no matter how much we can prove it, it is still a gift that that solution still works in resolving that problem. And the cool thing is that with that in mind, the theory of change still stands as important and still stands as valid. And that theory of change, the very thing of talking about how we know our solution is going to work, well, that's the thing that we're going to talk about in the upcoming weeks, to be able to fill the gap for you guys, fill the gap between this problem and this solution, and provide this body paragraph. But the biggest takeaway from this is not only that all solutions all solutions and all results are simply gifts, but also that we need to take the time to understand the expectations of ourselves and our organization, but take the time to understand the expectations of our donor, our financial or funding sources as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And I am now open for any questions that you guys may have at this time. Yes, Monica.
So with the theory of change, will you be guiding us through that or providing steps for it, or is that just something we need to know about?
So the theory of change, I will be doing a broad overview of what it is. The guiding you through it, those are individual services that I provide offhand that actually have a charge to it.
Okay.
So that's through the consultation and stuff like that. And so I can guide you through that, but that is a different section other than this.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
No problem. Awesome. So if there are no other questions, I thank you guys so much for joining this week. And please, again, I'm always going to say this, even though I don't need to sometimes, but please email me if you have any further questions. If you want individual support, please just schedule a free consultation on my website, focusgrants.org. And I'm really just appreciative of you guys letting me be a part of your journeys of change and stories of growth. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. But I will see you guys next week.
Thank you, Jameson.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.